Kia ora tātou, talofa lava. I want to begin by acknowledging country and paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands I'm speaking to through here. Acknowledge their enduring sovereignty has never been ceded. And I also want to pay my respects to the people of Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, who are the indigenous peoples, the mana whenua of the lands where I'm speaking to you from, which is in Tāmaki Makaurau, Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a great privilege to be here. Thanks so much, Erin and Julia, for accommodating me by Zoom. I'm really gutted I can't be there with you all and to join in some of the amazing panels yesterday. But yeah, I have to teach. And thanks so much, John, for the intro. So like my title suggests, my contribution that I want to share and explore today is about exploring the possibilities and impossibilities around calling for climate reparations for Pacific peoples. And it's quite a rough, I guess, piece of work or kind of things that I have in my head at the moment, so please be with me. But just to start off a bit about myself to understand why I'm exploring possibilities / impossibilities of climate reparations for Pacific peoples. I'm a Pacific Islander from the Samoan diaspora in New Zealand and Australia. I was born in Nam, but I was raised here in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland. So I've grown up in settler colonies while being indigenous to lands and waters elsewhere in Oceania. My experiences as a part of a racialized, marginalized group have led me to law and becoming a legal researcher interested in critical approaches to understanding law from my own Pacific Samoan diasporic perspective, especially keen on things like human rights, police and prison abolition, and climate justice. Anyway, last year I randomly came to be counsel acting for the Pacific Island state of the Cook Islands in the climate advisory proceedings before the ICJ last year, which is a bit of an odd and strange position for a critical legal scholar with abolitionist politics and a deeply critical view of international law to find themselves in. But I took it on board. And basically, the whole process required me to take seriously the question of state responsibility for breaches of states' obligations in respect of climate change, and therefore the possibilities of climate reparations for the Pacific from high-emitting states, including Australia. And as a Pacific critical legal researcher and abolitionist of wanting to abolish all things settler, colonial, imperialist, I had my own personal reservations about going about this task of exploring climate reparations with international law. As I'm sure many of you have said already, Australia has ignored the Billy decision for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family. And for Pacific Island states, Australia continues to show how it really sees us and our lands, where despite the heavy DFAT propaganda of the Pacific family or Pacific neighbors, we're seeing rising emissions, a deeply inequitable palm labor scheme, support of AUKUS, which threatens peace and security in our region. And with respect to climate change specifically, we have the controversial Australia Tuvalu Whalepili Union, some of you may have heard of, and some Tuvaluan commentators have said erodes Tuvalu sovereignty in its security matters to serve Australia and the US's geopolitical interests in the region in exchange for some very limited and suspicious climate gains. But for me, the big moment of clarity around this question about climate reparations for the Pacific came when I was at the ICJ advisory proceedings last December, where it gave me a very up and close personal look at the Australian state and what it's capable of and what it's incapable of. So specifically when Australia made its arguments on the first day of the proceedings, with regard to the second question on state responsibility, which had to deal with the legal possibility of climate reparations, it became very clear to me what several of our First Nations and Blackfellow siblings have been telling us for a very long time, that the Australia settler colonial state is incapable of stopping its genocidal and ecocidal settler violence against First Nations peoples, their lands and their waters, and those of other Indigenous peoples across the Pacific and around the world. Australia, in a nutshell, as you can see from this excerpt from its oral statement, started off similarly to the way that New Zealand did sometime later in the proceedings, with its usual colonial, benevolent, violent rhetoric around caring about climate change and the impacts of the Pacific, and seeing Pacific countries as their Pacific neighbors and acknowledging their leadership, and saying that they're committed to working with the Pacific to respond to climate change. But then not 15, 20 minutes later, we have Council for Australia completely trashing Pacific states' arguments, coordinated arguments around state responsibility and reparations. In my view, I won't go into it in too much depth, but I think they egregiously and shamelessly misrepresented issues around causation, and said, I have to admit in quite a persuasive way, that it's not for the courts to advise that states like Australia owe reparations at international law. So since then, I've been struggling and grappling with some questions from that experience, where I got to see Australia and really empire at large, and the way that it sees Pacific peoples, the way that it sees international law, and the way that it sees climate justice and its obligations. And here are some of the questions that I'll just quickly go through. So first, are climate reparations from Australia even possible for Pacific peoples, given the way that we know it's treated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island folks, who are our siblings, who we have connections and relations with since time immemorial, and of course the way that it approaches the Pacific in many different facets and regimes, including with climate change. And for me, that ICJ experience really made clear that it's not possible for Australia to do this. And of course, I think it's important to recognize today or yesterday, marking the 77th year of the ongoing Nakba against our Palestinian siblings, what Australia is doing, and how that's deeply interconnected with our climate justice struggles. And it makes it, I think, abundantly clear to me that it's never going to give reparations for us for climate or anything else. And then the other question that I want to think about with an open mind is, what is gained by Pacific peoples seeking climate reparations from Australia and other similar high emitting states? I guess my thinking here is, even though I personally believe that it's incapable of providing climate reparations, I guess the question is, what can the act or performance of Pacific people seeking reparations generate or inspire in terms of our fight for climate justice? So I guess a related question, or a question coming from that, is, can Pacific peoples and other Indigenous Global South folks use international courts and fora as political theatre to expose the inhumanity of Australia as a settler colonial state and all other settler states and empire more broadly, to radicalize Pacific peoples and others to divest from Australia and champion indigenous sovereignties? And I'm not too sure whether other Pacific peoples kind of are thinking along the same lines as that, or whether that's a very big kind of thing to suggest. So I think maybe a more pertinent or helpful question is, what is lost obscured, excluded, or precluded when Pacific people seek climate reparations from Australia at international law and beyond. And my main problem here is that by seeking reparations from Australia and kind of taking international law on its own terms at the ICJ and other fora, is that Pacific peoples may be upholding the illegitimacy of the settler colonial state and therefore undermining calls for the state to be dismantled for the full restoration of Indigenous sovereignties from our siblings, for our siblings. And of course, as many of you know, for Pacific sovereign states and regional organizations of these states, this recognition has been formative and long-standing since 50s, 60s, 70s. It is, of course, driven by aid, development, and other colonial dynamics and relationships. And these look different for every Pacific country. But my question for Pacific peoples, for Pacific states and leaders is, are we, by recognizing Australia and appealing to it to seek reparations, are we deeply betraying our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island siblings who we have relations to? And if so, what is being lost with this betrayal, not only relationally in terms of our ancestry, but also in terms of strategy and survival? What are we losing by placing faith and also power in a state and an empire that will never give us climate reparations and will only see us as sacrifice zones? The answer to me is that we are losing everything by doing that. And with that comes the last question, and sorry if I'm going over time, which is, what are the possibilities then that may come from refusing to seek climate reparations from Australia and others? And here I'm inspired by Chelsea Wadago's work on exploring what enacting a politics of refusal means and can look like for blackfellas against the settler colonial state of so-called Australia, drawing on Walter Simpson's work, looking at the US state, and thinking of refusal not as giving up, not as, I guess, pure nihilism, but as the exercise of sovereignty. And along those lines, Chelsea's other work, or her interview that she gave a few years ago, where she talks about how it's important for blackfellas to think less about appealing to this nation and more thinking about what our appeals to the nation kind of tell ourselves or tell blackfellas, and how we can possibly invest our labor in ourselves rather than investing our labor and resources into calling for reparations from a state that will never see them as human, and transferring that to the Pacific context will never see us as human and our lands as anything more than sacrifice zones. So those are my rough thoughts. I hope they made some sort of sense. Thank you so much for listening. I'll